So PBS put out a documentary that my brother put me onto called New York. And it's available on Amazon Video. So if you have like Amazon Prime or whatever, you can watch it for free. And if not, if you don't have Amazon Prime, you could probably like rent it on there or whatever. And I'm still going through it. I still haven't finished watching it. I'm on episode 5 or 6, I want to say. And I believe that there's 8 episodes, and each episode is like 2 hours long. So it's a dense stuff, but so good. It's not like boring dense. Well, if you're into like historical type shit, it's not boring, and if you're not, then it's probably boring as fuck. Like, I mentioned it to my wife, and to see, like, she wanted to watch, and like she almost threw up in her mouth. Because it's not, it's something that she's into, whatever. But I think it's so good, yo. It a couple things like resonated with me. Well, a lot of stuff resonated with me, but what I can think of now off the top of my head is things like stuff that you like don't really think of, like on a regular basis, and that we kind of take for granted. Like they mentioned in the documentary that we see like a structure like the Brooklyn Bridge and just assume that it's always been there, but there was literally a time that it wasn't there. And I know that intellectually we understand that, but just like look at the New York skyline and think of it when none of that was there, or like when before the Brooklyn Bridge or the Manhattan Bridge or the 59th Street Bridge or like whatever. Like these like massive fucking structures and undertakings once didn't exist. And this documentary goes into the stories of, for example, how the Brooklyn Bridge was built, and how like Irish laborers and Italian bricklayers and engineers, like this one engineer was like known for being like the man at engineering, and he was like an older guy, and his son was following in his footsteps, and he got sick and died. And his son, he either got sick and died, or he died tragically or something like that. But then his son took over, like calling the shots and like how to get this thing actually done, this massive thing that they had never thought of to do before. Built this massive structure now known as the Brooklyn Bridge that bridged the water gap between Brooklyn and Manhattan, which was, as it is now, the like main hub of New York City, like the main financial hub, the cultural hub, the just population hub as well, and really like the economic engine of New York and America at that time. And it tells you stories like that. It tells you stories of poets and writers like Walt Whitman, and how he captured and they read a lot of his like poetry and writings, and how he captured and internalized New York, and how he spoke of boats that he was on and the crisp night air in New York, and etc. It speaks about like the immigration waves, like when all the Irish people came, and after all the Dutch people came, and the Italians and the blacks, and how people like mingled and stuff like that, which is really interesting. What's really, really cool also is stuff like you find out who people were. Because, like, for example, I work on off of Fulton Street, downtown in the city. I don't know what the fuck Fulton means, like what it was, what it is. And I found out through this documentary that it's Fulton Street is named after Robert Fulton, and he was an artist who liked to like draw and shit, and he also like inventing things and like tinkering with stuff. And he, in the early days, it was like Wild Wild West type of thing, like people were like hustling trying to get theirs, and he had, I don't know if it was like a sailboat or a fucking canoe or some shit, and he was making money like moving things on water, and or moving people, I think, on water from like Manhattan to Brooklyn or wherever, somewhere he had some route that he would take, and he wound up inventing like a steamboat. He didn't like invent the steam engine. He just found an innovative way to like implement it. They compare him to like Henry Ford, that he didn't create the automobile, but he created the assembly line that just started like mass producing the automobile. So anyway, when he got like tired of like painting portraits and stuff like that, and he somehow or another built a steamboat and started a commercial service, running shit with his steamboat. And he was said to be instrumental in transport and innovating how like quickly it was done through his steamboat, because the steam engine existed but not the application of it to the actual boat. And they say that he like pushed America into the Industrial Revolution age, prior to dying in 1815 by this like innovative thing. And Fulton Street is named after that dude. And I found out like a bunch of stuff like that. The documentary shows video and footage and lots of photography from back then, from back in the day, and just like construction stuff like the Flatiron Building, which is like that triangle looking building. When that was built, when the Empire State Building was built, it goes into just like everything, politics, and like governors like Filadoro LaGuardia, and Tammany Hall, which was like the Irish stronghold and like muscle behind their politics and politicians that they pushed. It goes into like racism and discrimination and wealth inequality and just like so much stuff. And then there's like outtakes of like interviews with historians and writers and stuff like that, and they add a lot of color and context to everything. There's actually a couple excerpts that I wanted to play for you guys that I jotted down, and I'm gonna play them now, but I don't remember off the top of my head what the hell they were or what they were about. Just stuff that I thought was dope and that I liked. So I think I got like 2 or 3. And here goes the first one.
I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seemed strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Reese.
Many of the tenements were life-threatening, literally. That is to say that the threat of disease, infectious bacterial diseases like dysentery, for example, was always there, and epidemics could spread rapidly. The high death rate, the high sickness rate. This was the reality for many hundreds of thousands, millions of New Yorkers in any given moment.
Ill-fed and ill-clothed, packed into buildings with few sinks or toilets, and sometimes with no plumbing at all. Tenement dwellers were prey to every kind of disease: diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, pneumonia. Worst of all was the disease called the White Plague, tuberculosis. Every year, 20,000 new cases were reported in the slums. Every year, 8,000 people died of the disease.
July and August spell death to the army of little ones, whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. Sleepless mothers walk the street in the gray of the early dawn, trying to stir a cooling breeze to fan the brow of the sick baby. There is no sadder sight than this patient devotion against fearfully hopeless odds. Little coffins are stacked mountains high on the decks of the Charity Commissioner's boat when it makes its semi-weekly trip to the city cemetery. Jacob Reese.
How the Other Half Lives awakened New Yorkers to the condition of the poor, as nothing else had. It was a new way of seeing the world, a modern way. And Reese used it not only to underscore his outrage, but to spur people to action. The slums were not inevitable, he insisted. They had been built by men and women could change them.
One of the things that Reese is trying to do in this book, I think, is to get away from some of the older Victorian notions of poverty. Why are some people poor? Why do some people live in such terrible conditions? And his answer is more along the lines of a modern sort of environmental view of poverty. What he's basically arguing is that if people are going to live in these terrible tenements, if people are going to be deprived of the basics of light and air, decency, we can't be surprised if these people become criminals or depraved or alcoholics or what have you. So that there's a way in which Reese is, I think, the opening shot, if you will, or the first chapter in a Reformed tradition, because it was a book that made a lot of people want to get involved in improving life in the city.
Not long after the book was published, New York's energetic young civil service commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt, called on Reese at his office on Printing House Square. The writer was out, but Roosevelt left his calling card with a note on the back. "I have read your book," it said, "and I have come to help."
I thought that was so dope because this writer, Jacob Reese, wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And if you watch this episode in its full context, like it shows how the income inequality was so exacerbated back then because you had like uber rich and then a boatload of the majority of people living in slums in New York City. And by uber rich, I mean like filthy, like grossly rich, and not grossly like it's a gross negative bad thing, but just like hugely like rich, like all those, like you see those like buildings that are like department buildings and shit like that now, like on Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue and like the Gap and fucking Macy's or like whatever, like all those were like rich people mansions like back then. And this book, like his writing, his observations of like what was going on, his objective like view of the situation, put into print, like the power of words, the power of writing. It all revolves around writing, right? That got the attention of Theodore Roosevelt, who later went on to be a president of the United States and was known to be a reformer. And I just thought that was pretty cool. All right, let's check out the next clip.
I remember one time after the war, I was about 12. My father had a job in a factory across the way. And because he had lost his leg, he had a stump and a wooden artificial leg. And in the summer, and there's nothing quite as ferocious as a New York August, he would work on this assembly line 8 hours a day, and he was home that night, and I heard him weeping in the dark around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I knew that no matter what I ever did, I couldn't articulate it exactly, that I had to honor that pain, that you must honor that. And I think that's what the children of immigrants do, all of us. We know what they gave up. They gave up their countries. In some cases, they gave up their languages. They worked at the lousiest, rottenest jobs in order to put food on our tables. We have to honor that for the rest of our lives.
That was writer Pete Hamill. And as the son of an immigrant myself, I absolutely couldn't agree more. When I just think of like how my parents came here and sacrifices that they made and have things that they've gone through to provide for their growing family, a better life, you know, for me, my brother, and ultimately for our families, you know, their children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, etc. It's so selfless, so honorable to take a risk like that is for your betterment, but more so for the lasting impact of your extended family. Not extended family, your like family tree. Like, that's just like something amazing that immigrants, especially in this country, coming to America, have been doing since the Dutch. At our core, like, that's what we are. That's what we're made up of. That audacity to hope for a better future and the tenacity to work hard and make it happen.